The first contact between humanity and the wider galaxy did not begin with war or wonder, but with dismissal, because when human envoys finally stood before the unified stellar assembly, they were met with thin smiles, impatient gestures, and a quiet certainty among the assembled species that these newcomers from a yellow star were irrelevant. And the record shows that the session lasted less than 12 minutes before the presiding delegates moved on to matters they considered more serious, such as border disputes between old empires and resource claims around dying suns, while human ambassador John Carter, a former naval officer with gray at his temples and a voice trained to remain steady under pressure, stood listening as the assembly speaker spoke about humanity as if he were not in the room, referring to Earth as a developing system, a minor culture, and a potential labor source rather than a sovereign power. And when Carter attempted to object, he was cut off by a crystalline being from the Varix Dominion, who calmly stated that the Assembly had already reviewed humanity's military capacity and found it statistically insignificant, which drew mild amusement from the chamber and ended the matter. And so Carter returned to Earth with a simple report that was transmitted to governments, fleets, and research councils across the planet, stating only that diplomacy had failed because the galaxy did not consider humanity worth listening to, and that single sentence changed the course of history more than any speech ever could, because humanity had learned something vital in that moment. Not that the galaxy was hostile, but that it was complacent, and complacency was something humans had learned to exploit long before they reached the stars. And while alien observers continued to categorize Earth as a low-threat world, human shipyards quietly expanded in lunar orbit, not with grand displays or ceremonial launches, but with modular construction, methods refined from centuries of industrial warfare, and scientists like Laura Bennett, a propulsion engineer who had grown up watching old war documentaries, pushed experimental drives that did not prioritize elegance or efficiency, but redundancy and survivability, creating vessels that could take punishment far beyond what standard galactic combat doctrines expected, because most spacefaring species avoided damage altogether, while humans assumed damage was inevitable and planned accordingly. And at the same time, Admiral Frank Harris of the United Earth Fleet began reorganizing command structures away from rigid hierarchies and toward adaptive task groups, each capable of independent action if cut off from central command, a concept that alien strategists dismiss as chaotic, but which humans recognize as resilience. And while these preparations unfolded, the galaxy barely noticed, because its attention was fixed on expansion and internal rivalries. And when the Korlith Imperium, a militarized empire with a long tradition of conquest, began pushing its borders toward human space, the Assembly merely noted that a primitive system lay in the path and predicted swift compliance. And the first Korlith envoy arrived at Earth orbit not to negotiate, but to dictate terms, informing Earth's leaders that humanity would submit to protectorate status, provide raw materials, and accept Korlith oversight in exchange for nominal survival. And the envoy's tone was not cruel but bored, as if reciting a process completed many times before, and President Ellen Brooks listened without interruption before responding with a refusal that was calm, formal, and absolute, stating that humanity would not surrender its sovereignty, and the envoy responded with genuine surprise followed by irritation, warning that resistance would lead to force, to which Brooks replied that humanity understood force very well, and the transmission ended, and across the galaxy this exchange was barely recorded, another footnote in the expansion of an established power. But on Earth it marked the end of restraint, because humanity had spent generations telling itself that cooperation was preferable to conflict, but it also survived history by knowing when to draw a line, and the Korlith fleet that arrived 3 weeks later expected panic, surrender, or at worst a disorganized defense. And instead they encountered a silent system, because human ships did not broadcast challenges or warnings. They powered down non-essential emissions and waited. And when the first Korlith scouts crossed the heliopause, they were destroyed without ceremony by kinetic strikes launched from extreme range, weapons so simple and brutally effective that Korlith sensors initially misidentified them as debris impacts, and confusion spread to their command as more ships were lost, not to exotic energy beams or elegant maneuvers, but to sustained, coordinated fire that exploited every weakness in their shield modulation cycles. And the humans did not pursue fleeing vessels or boast of their success. They simply held the line, forcing the Korlith to commit more forces to a battle they no longer understood, and only then did alien analysts begin to pay attention, reviewing combat data with disbelief as they realized that humanity had not only matched Korlith technology, but adapted it, modified it, and in some cases deliberately simplified it to make it harder to disrupt, and the realization spread slowly through the assembly that humanity had not been idle or ignorant, only quiet, and that quiet had mass preparation. And as the first true battle of the human galactic war unfolded, a single truth became impossible to ignore. Humanity was not fighting to prove dominance or claim territory. It was fighting because it had been pushed, and history had shown again and again that when humanity was pushed far enough, it did not back down, it dug in, adapted, and endured, until the cost of opposing became unbearable, and the galaxy was about to learn that lesson in full, though it did not yet understand how high the price would be, and this was only the beginning. The early reports from the Korlith Imperium reached the unified stellar assembly fragmented and delayed because the Korlith command structure had never needed to prioritize transparency when fighting lesser species, and initial losses were explained away as navigational errors or isolated ambushes. Yet as weeks passed and no decisive victory was announced, concern began to surface among observers who understood Korlith doctrine, since the Imperium did not stall once it committed force, and inside Korlith Space Admiral Vestaler, a veteran of dozens of suppression campaigns, reviewed sensor logs with growing unease as patterns emerged that did not align with any known enemy profile, because human fleets did not concentrate for glorious engagements or retreat. When outmatched, they dispersed, harassed, withdrew, and returned from unexpected vectors, applying pressure constantly without offering a clear target. And Taller realized with a chill that humanity was not attempting to win a single battle, but to exhaust an empire, a strategy rarely employed in galactic warfare, because most species lack the patience and logistical depth for it. And yet humans seem built for it, rotating crews, repairing ships rapidly, and fielding replacements faster than Korlith intelligence models had predicted. And when Taller requested reinforcement fleets, the response from the Imperium Council was delayed by political infighting, because admitting difficulty against a so-called primitive species threatened internal prestige, and that delay cost them dearly, as human task groups led by captains like Daniel Moore and Susan Alvarez began striking Korlith supply convoys, not destroying them outright, but disabling key vessels and leaving the rest adrift, forcing rescue operations that tied up warships and slowed the entire advance. And these actions were not random but carefully timed, hitting logistics hubs just as frontline units reported shortages, creating a cascading strain that Korlith commanders struggled to explain, and on Earth analysts watched intercepted communications with grim satisfaction, not celebrating but confirming that their assumptions had been correct, that empires built on intimidation and speed faltered when forced into prolonged resistance, and President Brooks authorized expanded defensive zones, not to conquer but to deny, pushing human influence outward in layered shells designed to absorb and redirect attacks, while scientists like Mark Ellison worked around the clock refining countermeasures based on live combat feedback, adjusting shield harmonics, and targeting algorithms in days rather than decades, a pace that stunned alien observers once they realized it was happening, and within the assembly whispers began to circulate, quiet at first, that humanity might be more dangerous than anticipated, though few were willing to say it openly, because doing so would mean admitting a failure of judgment, and the Varric's dominion. Delegate who had dismissed John Carter now reviewed his own statements with unease as new data contradicted every assumption he had made, and still the assembly did nothing, paralyzed by procedure and arrogance, while the war expanded beyond its initial scope, because the Korlith Imperium, frustrated and embarrassed, escalated by targeting human colonies on the edge of settled space, believing that civilian losses would force capitulation, and the first colony strike destroyed a habitat ring around Proxima Centauri, killing thousands, an act that was broadcast across human networks within minutes. And the reaction was not panic but resolve, as recruitment surged, industrial output spiked, and fleets that had been held in reserve were activated, and Admiral Harris addressed the unified command with a message that was brief and unadorned, stating that humanity would no longer limit itself to defense, and that the objective was now to make continued aggression impossible. And with that, shift human strategy evolved, no longer content to bleed the Imperium slowly. Human fleets began coordinated counteroffensives, striking Korlith forward bases with overwhelming force, not lingering to occupy but destroying infrastructure and withdrawing before reinforcements could arrive. and the psychological impact was immediate, as Korlith citizens who had never known fear began to question the narrative of inevitable victory, and alien traders rerouted shipping away from contested zones, disrupting economies tied to Korlith power. And for the first time in centuries, the Imperium felt the pressure of isolation, and all the while humanity said little to the wider galaxy, issuing no grand declarations, making no demands, simply continuing forward with determination that had been forged long before spaceflight, the determination to endure losses, adapt tactics, and refuse surrender no matter the odds. And as casualty reports mounted and assembly analysts finally began to understand the scale of what was unfolding, a single conclusion became unavoidable. The galaxy had mistaken silence for weakness and patience for passivity, and in doing so it had awakened a species that did not seek domination but would not accept subjugation. And the longer the conflict continued, the clearer it became that humanity was not fighting for victory as the galaxy defined it, but for survival on its own terms, a goal that left no room for backing down. As the conflict widened beyond the original border regions, the galaxy's neutral powers began to feel the disturbance in ways they could not ignore, because shipping lanes once considered safe grew unpredictable and insurance markets across multiple systems collapsed under the uncertainty of a war that refused to follow expected patterns. And observers sent by trading coalitions reported that human fleets behaved unlike any force they had studied, refusing to hold territory for prestige and instead prioritizing denial and disruption, a method that created instability without presenting a clear front line. And within the Unified Stellar Assembly emergency sessions were finally convened, though even then many delegates framed the situation as a temporary imbalance rather than a systemic threat, while intelligence summaries revealed a more troubling reality, that humanity's industrial output had not peaked but continued to rise, fueled by a population that treated the war not as an abstract conflict but as a shared burden, with civilian sectors reorganizing voluntarily to support logistics, medical research, and ship repair, a level of societal integration that most galactic species had abandoned long ago in favor of professional militaries detached from daily life. And this integration allowed humans to absorb losses that would have broken other civilizations, replacing ships and crews with grim efficiency. And on the Korlith side, Admiral Taller faced increasing pressure from political overseers who demanded decisive results, pushing him toward confrontation he knew favored the enemy. Yet refusal was not an option, because the Imperium's authority depended on visible dominance. And so a massive fleet was assembled to strike at a core human shipyard near Mars, a target chosen not for its strategic necessity, but for symbolic value. And when the Korlith Armada emerged from jump space, it was met by human forces that appeared outnumbered and hastily deployed. A sight that restored some confidence among Korlith commanders, who advanced expecting to overwhelm resistance. And the opening exchange seemed to confirm their assumptions, as several human vessels were crippled under concentrated fire, retreating behind defensive screens. But the battle did not unfold as predicted, because those damaged ships did not withdraw to safety, but continued transmitting targeting data, acting as forward observers, while human artillery platforms hidden behind planetary bodies and debris fields opened fire, striking from angles the Korlith had not accounted for. And as the engagement intensified, human electronic warfare units flooded Korlith networks with false signals, forcing commanders to choose between contradictory threat reports, and the resulting hesitation proved fatal, as human strike groups executed coordinated attacks on command ships, not to destroy them immediately, but to disable communication arrays, isolating segments of the Armada and turning a unified force into fragmented clusters. And throughout the battle, human captains made decisions that astonished alien analysts, sacrificing tactical advantage in one area to secure strategic leverage elsewhere, withdrawing when success seemed within reach and pressing attacks that appeared reckless, all in service of a larger plan that only became visible in hindsight. And when the battle ended hours later, the Korlith fleet withdrew in disarray, having failed to achieve its objective and suffering losses that could no longer be concealed. And the images of damaged capital ships limping home spread to the Imperium's networks despite censorship efforts, igniting unrest among populations that had been promised swift victory. And across the galaxy, these images circulated with growing alarm, prompting emergency diplomatic outreach, as minor powers sought assurances that they would not be drawn into the conflict, and humanity responded with consistent message delivered by Ambassador Carter, who had returned to the assembly not as a dismissed observer, but as a representative of a proven force, stating that humanity sought no expansion and no tribute, only the right to exist without coercion, and that any power that respected that boundary would find humanity a reliable partner, but those that did not would face consequences they could not escape. And this message, delivered without threats or embellishment, resonated more deeply than any grand declaration, because it aligned with the evidence now impossible to deny that humanity fought not out of rage or ambition, but out of an unyielding refusal to submit. And as analysts compiled projections showing that continued war would erode Korlith power beyond recovery, a realization settled over the assembly like a shadow that the galaxy's balance had shifted not because humanity sought to rule, but because it would not back down, and that trait, once dismissed as stubbornness, had become the defining force shaping a new era of interstellar relations. The aftermath of the failed Korlith assault near Mars marked a turning point that even the most rigid observers could not ignore, because for the first time in recorded Imperial history, the Imperium began losing influence faster than territory, as client states questioned protection guarantees, and long-suppressed rivals tested borders that had once been untouchable. And inside Korlith High Command emergency councils devolved into blame and accusation, with Admiral Taller arguing that the war could no longer be won through conventional escalation, while political leaders demanded harsher measures to restore fear, and this internal fracture bled into operational effectiveness, as commanders received conflicting directives that undermined coordination, while on the human side there was no celebration, only recalibration, because Admiral Harris and his staff treated every success as temporary and every failure as data, refining doctrine with relentless focus, and human fleets shifted. Again, this time pushing deeper into contested space not to conquer worlds, but to dismantle infrastructure nodes that sustain Korlith projection, targeting repair yards, fuel depots, and communication relays with precision strikes that minimize civilian casualties while maximizing strategic disruption, a pattern that confused alien analysts accustomed to wars of annihilation or occupation. And this restraint, paradoxically, amplified the psychological impact, because it demonstrated control rather than desperation, and reports from neutral observers described human commanders offering evacuation windows before strikes, an act seen by some as moral signaling, and by others as calculated messaging, reinforcing the narrative that humanity fought with purpose rather than cruelty. And within the unified Stellar Assembly, debates grew heated as factions argued over whether to intervene diplomatically, militarily, or not at all. Yet every proposal stalled on the same fear, that choosing incorrectly could invite human retaliation or Korlith collapse, both outcomes carrying unacceptable risk. And Ambassador Carter used this paralysis to humanity's advantage, engaging in quiet bilateral talks that secured trade agreements and intelligence sharing with systems that had once dismissed Earth, building a web of relationships that further isolated the Imperium. And as weeks turned into months, the economic strain on Korlith space became severe, with shortages triggering protests that security forces struggled to contain, while human media broadcasts, accessible across much of the galaxy, documented the war in a matter-of-fact tone that contrasted sharply with Korlith propaganda, showing damaged human ships being repaired, crews rotating home, and leaders acknowledging losses openly, a transparency that built trust internally and credibility externally. And the contrast between these approaches did not go unnoticed by alien populations who began questioning their own rulers. And in one decisive engagement near the system of Draxel, a Korlith task force attempted to ambush a human logistics convoy only to be counter-ambushed by layered defenses that revealed how deeply human intelligence had penetrated Imperium planning, resulting in the capture of several senior officers whose testimonies later confirmed what many suspected, that Korlith strategy had become reactive and unfocused, while humanity dictated tempo and scope. And as news of these captures spread, confidence within the Imperium faltered further, prompting some provincial governors to withhold resources in anticipation of regime change. And all the while humanity continued advancing its stated objective of making aggression impossible, not by seizing thrones, but by eroding the systems that sustained them. And by the time Assembly analysts presented their updated assessments, showing that the Korlith Imperium could not sustain another year of conflict without internal collapse, a sobering truth sailed across the galaxy, that humanity had transformed a defensive war into a lesson in endurance and adaptation, proving that backing down was not merely a tactical choice, but a cultural impossibility. and that any power that forced humanity into conflict would face not a single decisive blow, but a steady, unrelenting pressure that only ended when the threat was gone. A reality the galaxy was still struggling to accept as the war moved inexorably toward its conclusion. As signs of Korlith instability became impossible to hide, the Imperium's ruling council made a decision that would later be studied as the moment their fate was sealed, because rather than seeking to escalation or accepting mediated talks, they authorized what they called a final assertion, a concentrated campaign aimed directly at Earth itself, believing that a visible threat to humanity's cradle would force political fracture and public fear, and this belief revealed how little they truly understood their enemy. Since human history was filled with examples of societies hardening rather than breaking when their home was threatened, and when intelligence of the planned strike reached Earth, it was not suppressed or softened, but released to the public in full detail, accompanied by a brief address from President Brooks stating that the coming weeks would be difficult, that losses were expected, and that surrender was not an option, and the response across Earth and its colonies was immediate and unified, with volunteer rates exceeding projections, civilian industries shifting again into wartime footing, and regional governments coordinated without dispute, a level of cohesion that alien sociologists had once deemed impossible for such a diverse species. And as human fleets redeployed inward to form layered defenses around Sol, Admiral Harris made a controversial decision to leave certain approach vectors apparently underdefended, a move that drew concern even within his own command staff. Yet Harris understood Korlith psychology well enough by now to predict that they would interpret visible restraint as weakness rather than a trap. And when the Korlith Armada finally emerged into Sol space, it did so with overwhelming numbers and ceremonial formation, broadcasting declarations of dominance intended as much for internal audiences as for humanity. And the opening salvos struck outer defense platforms, destroying several and creating dramatic images that Korlith propagandists quickly distributed. But the deeper the Armada pushed, the more resistance intensified, as human ships engaged in staggered waves, drawing enemy formations apart, forcing them to commit reserves prematurely, and as the battle escalated, hidden human assets activated, including autonomous defense swarms and kinetic arrays embedded in planetary debris fields, technologies deliberately omitted from earlier engagements to preserve surprise, and the result was a grinding confrontation that stripped away Korlith numerical advantage piece by piece, while human commanders rotated damaged units out and fresh ones in, maintaining pressure without collapse, and crucially Earth itself did not panic. Because evacuation plans were executed calmly, essential services continued, and communication networks remained open, reinforcing a sense of collective endurance rather than fear. And as hours turned into days, the Korlith offensive stalled within Sol, unable to break through defenses, yet unwilling to retreat, trapped in a battle of attrition they had never intended to fight. And during this period, Ambassador Carter addressed the unified Stellar Assembly one final time before communications were severed by the intensity of the conflict, stating plainly that humanity had not chosen this war, that it had offered coexistence and been dismissed, and that now it would see the conflict through to its end. And this statement, delivered without anger or triumph, resonated across the galaxy as reports of the ongoing battle flooded in, showing that humanity was holding against an empire's full force, not through superior numbers but through preparation, adaptability, and unyielding will to continue. And when at last the Korlith Armada began its withdrawal, leaving behind wreckage and shattered prestige, the realization spread beyond the Imperium to every corner of the galaxy that threatening humanity's home had not weakened it, but unified it completely, and that the line humanity drew around its existence was not symbolic but absolute, a line it would defend regardless of cost, reinforcing the lesson that had begun this war and was now impossible to ignore, that humanity never backs down, because backing down has never been how it survives. The withdrawal of the Korlith Armada from Sol did not bring peace but clarity, because in retreat the Imperium exposed how deeply the war had hollowed it out, with damaged fleets unable to regroup, supply lines fractured beyond repair, and command authority eroded by months of failure. And as human intelligence tracked the retreating forces, it became clear that this was not a tactical repositioning, but the beginning of collapse, prompting Admiral Harris to authorize a limited pursuit not to annihilate the fleeing ships, but to ensure they could not reconstitute, striking at repair docks and rally points with precision that left no illusion of recovery, while within Korlith space governors and sector lords began acting independently, some fortifying their worlds against imagined human invasion, others opening discrete channels to Earth seeking guarantees of non-retaliation, and humanity responded consistently through Ambassador Carter, offering the same terms it had always stated. No occupation, no tribute, only cessation of hostilities and recognition of sovereignty, terms that would have once been dismissed as laughably generous but now carried the weight of demonstrated resolve, and across the galaxy reactions diverged sharply, with some powers expressing relief that humanity did not seek conquest, while others grew uneasy at the precedent set by a species that could dismantle an empire without claiming its throne, because this kind of power was harder to predict and, therefore, harder to control. And inside the Unified Stellar Assembly emergency reforms were proposed to prevent similar miscalculations, including revised threat assessments and mandatory engagement protocols for emerging species, though many recognize these measures as too late to change what had already happened. And among human populations, the war effort continued with quiet determination rather than celebration. Memorials were held for dead, resources were redirected to reconstruction, even as fleets remained on alert, and leaders emphasized that vigilance was not a temporary necessity, but a permanent responsibility, because humanity had learned that respect in the galaxy was not granted by words or treaties, but earned through the proven ability to defend one's existence. And as Korlith territory fractured into rival factions, some attempted last acts of defiance, launching isolated attacks that were swiftly neutralized, while others formally surrendered authority to provisional councils under assembly oversight, effectively ending the Imperium as a unified power. And historians would later note that humanity did not deliver the final blow, instead allowing the structures of oppression to collapse under their own weight one stripped of fear, a choice that reinforced perception of humans as relentless in defense but restrained in victory. And as trade resumed along stabilized routes and diplomatic missions arrived at Earth with newfound deference, a subtle shift took hold in galactic culture. Conversations began to include humanity not as a curiosity or a threat, but as a reference point, a species whose response to coercion had redefined acceptable risk. And though the war was not yet formally concluded, the outcome was no longer in doubt, because the galaxy now understood something fundamental that it had failed to grasp at first contact, that humanity's greatest strength was not any single weapon or tactic, but a collective refusal to yield when its future was at stake. A refusal that turned endurance into strategy and patience into power, and this understanding spread faster than any fleet ever could, reshaping calculations in halls of power far beyond the reach of human ships, ensuring that long after the last shots were fired, the memory of this war would endure as a warning written not in treaties, but in the quiet certainty that forcing humanity to back down was no longer considered possible. In the long interval between the effective end of organized Korlith resistance and the formal conclusion of hostilities, the galaxy entered a period of uneasy adjustment, because power vacuums rarely remain empty, and collapse of an empire sends ripples that disturb even distant systems. And as provisional authorities struggled to maintain order in former Korlith regions, piracy flared, old grudges resurfaced, and border skirmishes threatened to ignite new conflicts, yet humanity did not withdraw into isolation as some had feared, instead deploying limited stabilization patrols at the request of local councils, not as occupiers but as guarantors of transit safety, operating under strict rules of engagement that emphasize restraint and accountability. And this presence, though modest, carried enormous symbolic weight, because it demonstrated that humanity was willing to shoulder responsibility without claiming dominion, a balance that few galactic powers had ever managed. And within the Unified Stellar Assembly, debates shifted from whether humanity posed a danger to how its example might reshape interstellar norms, as analysts presented case studies showing that human doctrine emphasized survivability, adaptability, and societal cohesion over spectacle, qualities that challenged long-held assumptions about how power should be displayed. And Ambassador Carter became a frequent figure in these discussions, his measured statements reinforcing the idea that humanity's actions were guided by principles rather than impulse. And back on Earth, Admiral Harris oversaw a gradual transition from wartime posture to sustained readiness, warning political leaders that complacency would be the true enemy in the years ahead. Because the lesson of the war was not that humanity was invincible, but that preparation and unity had been decisive, and these qualities required constant maintenance. And among the human population, the war left deep marks. Families grieving losses. Even as they rebuilt, veterans reintegrating into civilian life with support structures strengthened by shared experience, and cultural narratives shifting subtly to emphasize collective responsibility over individual heroism, reflecting the reality that victory had been the product of millions of coordinated efforts rather than a single defining moment. And as trade and diplomacy expanded, new alliances formed, some formalized through treaties and others through habit and trust, with humanity often acting as an intermediary between former rivals, leveraging its reputation for firmness and fairness. And this role was not without cost, because it placed humans at the center of disputes that carried their own risks, yet leaders accepted this burden as part of the price of having altered the balance of power. And in academic circles across the galaxy, the war became a subject of intense study, with scholars examining how a species once dismissed had leveraged endurance and adaptability to overcome an entrenched empire, often concluding that the decisive factor was not technology but mindset, the willingness to absorb hardship without surrendering purpose. And as these interpretations spread, they influenced the strategies of emerging powers, some seeking to emulate human resilience, and others quietly adjusting their ambitions to avoid provoking a similar response. And through it all, humanity remained consistent in its messaging, neither glorifying a conflict nor apologizing for it, simply stating through President Brooks in a widely circulated address that peace was always preferable but never guaranteed, and that humanity would always choose coexistence when offered but would never accept extinction or subjugation, a statement that resonated precisely because it matched observed behavior. As the galaxy continued to recalibrate around this reality, it became clear that the war had done more than end an empire. It had established a boundary condition for interstellar politics, a shared understanding that humanity's refusal to back down was not bluster, but a demonstrated constant, shaping decisions long after fighting ceased, and setting the stage for a future in which that lesson would be tested not by open war, but by how well the galaxy learned to live with species that had proven it would endure any cost to remain free. The formal end of the war came quietly, without ceremony or spectacle, when the Unified Stellar Assembly ratified the cessation accords recognizing humanity as a sovereign equal and acknowledging the dissolution of the Korlith Imperium. And the document itself was unremarkable, a collection of clauses and signatures that belied the weight of history behind it. Yet across the galaxy, its implications were profound, because it marked the first time an established empire had been undone not by conquest, but by the sustained refusal of a targeted species to submit. And as the accord retransmitted to Earth, President Brooks addressed the population with a message that avoided triumphalism, stating that the outcome did not make humanity superior, only responsible, because survival had been secured at great cost, and the future would demand the same discipline and unity that the war had required. And fleet stood down from emergency posture into a doctrine of vigilant presence, maintaining readiness while shifting resources toward reconstruction, exploration, and diplomacy, and the shipyards that had once churned out warships adapted to build transports, research vessels, and defensive platforms designed to deter rather than invite conflict, while scientists and engineers redirected lessons learned into safer technologies that reduced collateral damage and improved resilience. And across former Korlith territories, local governments stabilized under assembly oversight, gradually restoring trade and communication, with many citizens expressing cautious gratitude toward the humans who had not occupied their worlds or exacted revenge, a restraint that contrasted sharply with the old imperial narrative and fostered a slow but genuine reconciliation. And in the assembly halls, delegates revised protocols for first contact and conflict resolution, embedding the hard-earned understanding that dismissal and coercion carried risks beyond calculation, and that emerging species could no longer be evaluated solely by visible power, because adaptability, cohesion, and endurance had proven decisive. And for humanity, the war entered memory not as a singular victory, but as a defining test, one that reinforced cultural values of persistence and collective effort, shaping education, policy, and interstellar engagement for generations. And when historians later summarized the conflict, they did not focus on specific battles or technologies, but on the pattern that ran through every phase, that humanity responded to underestimation with preparation, to aggression with resolve, and to victory with restraint. And this pattern became the reference by which future crises were judged, a quiet but enduring influence on galactic behavior. And long after the wreckage had been cleared and the borders redrawn, the lesson remained embedded in strategic doctrine and popular understanding alike, that provoking humanity was not a gamble worth taking, because it did not back down when threatened. It adapted, endured, and pressed forward until the threat was gone, and in that certainty the galaxy found new equilibrium, one shaped not by fear or domination, but by respect for a species that had shown it would rather bear any burden than surrender its right to exist, closing a chapter of conflict and opening an era defined by the knowledge that humanity's resolve was no longer an unknown variable, but a constant that had to be accounted for in every calculation that followed